So we know there are a lot of things that can affect how intelligible speech is, especially when we're dealing with noisy situations, which is an important challenge for a lot of listeners. So we know that having semantic context present helps you understand the speech. We know that being able to see the person you're talking to helps intelligibility. If speakers speak clearly, that helps. And so all of these things we know are important for improving intelligibility, but we don't know as much about how they interact with one another, and then especially how the benefits of these things might be affected by the kind of noise you're trying to cope with. So that was what we were really interested in looking at in this study. So all of those factors were, it was fairly complicated, but all of those factors were floating around in this study so that we could look at how they impacted one another. We confirmed a lot of things we already knew about these. Each of these cues was helpful as we expected, but they did interact with each other, and it also depended, how much they helped you depended on the kind of noise you were trying to deal with. So for example, people were better able to use visual cues when the speech they were listening to was produced clearly and when there was meaningful context. That visual input was especially helpful in those cases where you already had some of these other cues as well. And I think related to that, one of the really interesting findings was that the way in which people were able to use semantic context was heavily influenced by whether or not they could see the talker. So these are two things that we know help people, but actually it was really important that that ability to use semantic context really depended in many ways on being able to see the talker. So when they couldn't see the talker, they didn't get a benefit from semantic context in maskers that were other people talking. So if there were other people talking in the background, you didn't do much better on normal sentences like the hot sun warmed the ground compared to something weird like the green page felt the lid or something, which seems like, of course, it would be harder. But when people couldn't see the speaker, they weren't showing much of a difference between those conditions if the background was other people talking. But if it wasn't other people talking, they did get a big benefit of that meaningful context. So it seems like when we're trying to cope with people talking in the background, that might actually impact the way we're able to use the meaning of the target we're trying to listen to as well. I think for clinicians especially, the important thing is just the awareness that all these cues that we regularly counsel people to make use of as much as possible really do interact with one another and with the noise that people are dealing with. I mean, that's the general finding. But I think when we're trying to measure somebody's ability to handle speech and noise, which is valuable, it's often people's sort of number one real-world complaint. We tend to evaluate that with only a limited number of these cues. So we don't know, for example, somebody who has a lot of trouble in an audio-only situation might happen to also be somebody who can benefit a ton from visual input. So they might score really poorly on an audio-only speech and noise test, but if they were able to see the talker, you might find out that actually they can perform in normal range. So I think one thing to take away from this is that we could improve our assessment of how well people understand speech and noise by using a bigger range of conditions for testing. I have actually moved toward focusing more on the processing of foreign accented speech. And right now I'm interested in that from sort of a cognitive perspective, what the cognitive costs might be when we're working harder to understand someone with a foreign accent. So I'm really excited about that project and about understanding that better, but also about sort of bringing that work around to the work I talked about today in terms of looking at listening effort in the context of accents compared to effortful situations due to noise, and then what's going on when we're dealing with both of these things at the same time. So trying to understand an unfamiliar accent in a noisy situation and kind of pinning down the challenges and the cognitive and perceptual mechanisms that subserve success in these situations.